everybody. Welcome to the third episode of The Realign. I am Reed Wildermuth, and today I am speaking with Dougald Hine. Dougald Hine, you probably know him most from the Dark Mountain Manifesto, if you're familiar with that. He was the co-founder of that with Paul Kingsnorth. Before that, he was a journalist, often covering climate change issues. And currently he's a writer on Substack. He does Writing Home, which I highly recommend you read. But so first of all, this is our first time actually talking in person. We've seen each other in a few other meetings that we're involved in, including Black Elephant, which at some point I will tell everybody about. But so it's good to finally talk to you.
Yeah, likewise, Reed. Really good.
Yeah, and you're completely frozen on my screen, so that's okay. Thanks for everybody's patience with this. I am super tired today. But so, Dougald, you currently live in Sweden. You were born in England, correct?
Yeah. I grew up in the northeast of England, ended up here just over a decade ago.
A decade, okay. Yeah, so you're another one of those people who have moved to the continent like I have. I guess I moved a little bit further, but yeah, it's nice here and crazy and different. And you are just releasing a book in, I guess it's about 2 or 3 weeks from now, called At Work in the Ruins, which is what we're going to primarily be discussing there. It is subtitled Finding Our Place in the Time of Science, Climate Change, Pandemics, and All Other Emergencies. Now, I was quite honored to get an advance copy of this. This book is, the way I keep describing it to friends is it's this really calm book. Like, it's this really peaceful, gentle, calm book, despite what you're actually talking about. What you're talking about is how, we're completely stuck. We cannot even figure out how to get out of the mess that we're in. We're constantly fighting each other on what to do about climate change and all of that. So it should be a really harsh book, or one would think it would be a really harsh book, but actually it's gentle. It feels like this warm hug where someone's actually telling you, hey, we need to talk about this in a completely different way because this isn't getting us anywhere. Do you want to talk a little bit about why you wrote the book and how you wrote it?
Yeah, it started. It's a strange thing. I can literally tell you the place of its conception. I was walking around a corner of a field that is about half a mile from our home here, and I was talking over Zoom with our mutual friend, Felix Markard. And this was September 2021. And I heard these words come out of my mouth. I said, I think it's time to stop talking about climate change. And then I said, but I guess I'm going to have to write something about how that could possibly be the case. And I sat down and I thought I was writing an article that was kind of my farewell to this matter that I had been involved in a lot of conversations about, that I'd written a lot about over the last 15 years or so. And in 3 days, I wrote 3 chapters, and then I realized that it wasn't an article. It was something like, I realized I had a bigger fish on the end of the line than I thought, because I really needed to make sense for myself, let alone for anyone else, of how I could have got to this point where I no longer felt there was any life in the kinds of conversations that I had been willing to put a significant part of my time into with people who, from one direction or another, had arrived at this place of being deeply and justifiably alarmed about climate change and what it stands for. And so that's the starting point of the book, is me trying to puzzle through and actually retrace the steps from back when I first started to get freaked out about climate change myself, which would have been around 2005, really, through meeting Paul and the conversations between us that led us to Dark Mountain and all of the places where that took me, and retelling some of the stories from that journey in the light of a realization that there might have been things I was missing at the time. And I'm not. You said this to me when we were coming on the call today. It's a book which starts with me saying I'm not going to talk about climate change, and then there's quite a lot about climate change in the book.
Right.
But for most of the years when that was a thing that my work was centering around, the reason I kept coming back to it was because climate change seems like the place where the people who I would call the winners of modernity, the ones of us who are most insulated from the shadow side, the consequences of this whole thing that is often told in TED Talks as this grand story of progress. Climate change is very often the place where those people, which is kind of my people in a sense, come to a crisis, like where the shiny surface cracks and the thought that this might all be going down becomes a visceral, middle of the night thing that is interrupting your ability to comfortably inhabit the life that you've been born into. And from there, it becomes possible to open up this larger story about all of the other things that aren't necessarily directly to do with climate change, that are also part of the trouble that the world is in, and everything that's been missing from that, self-satisfied story of progress that modernity has liked to tell itself. But I began to doubt, I guess is the short version, in the middle of the pandemic. I began to doubt how far a conversation that starts from climate change can get to those places anymore. So that's what I'm probing at really in the book.
Yeah. So that you brought up a really big point that I think we'll talk about in a little bit on that, who is the framework of climate change primarily, being dominated by, I think, to some extent, the West or whatever you want to call it, the high industrialized, high capitalist nations are all for the first time starting to recognize the effects of the arrangement that they've had with the rest of the world, or actually kind of forced upon the rest of the world. But if you talk to somebody who's in a village whose water had been poisoned years ago, or anybody who's been living in coastal areas in the global south who has started to notice that, hey, we're losing our homes, or the storms are getting higher and higher. This is destroying our lives. Like, they've been feeling those effects a lot longer than those of us who have been living in more insulated areas. And so you bring up a point later in the book about the adults in the room, which we'll get to that in a bit. But I want to go back to the question of, like, why not talk about climate change, which of course you do all throughout the book. The book is a series of vignettes, and you're a great storyteller, by the way, where you discuss your conversations, your interviews, your kind of struggle to understand or to relate to lots of science, lots of climate scientists. You know a lot of them. You've been in the room with lots of policymakers. You've been asked to speak about climate change alongside people who are, the more typical people, the scientists that everybody wants to hear from, but all they can really tell you is, yeah, this is happening, but that's it. Like, nothing to do about it. But why did you feel that the conversation about climate change was not asking the right question? And of course, for anybody listening, it's not that you're denying any of this at all. In fact, the entire book is about how this is happening. But you're pointing out repeatedly that the framing is incorrect, that there's something we're missing in that. And one of the points you make is the limits of science and what science can tell us.
Well, here's the difficulty, and you've kind of set this up already, actually, in the way that you've just told the story. There are plenty of people for whom climate change is playing out in the present tense as something very obvious, And it kind of came home to me one day a few years ago in Stockholm, where I'd been contacted by this Sami woman who came from a reindeer herding family, and we're sat in a meeting room in the middle of this beautiful city, and she's telling me these stories about, the way that the land is changing, the way that the weather is changing, and the rhythm of the seasons, and the really concrete, extraordinary ruptures of things that could be taken for granted until quite recently that are part of her family's experience. And as I'm sitting there, I go, okay, if your life is bound up with the seasons, you actually don't need some head of some famous research institute standing in front of a PowerPoint telling you that things are going badly wrong. In a sense, it's those of us who are living behind the sort of triple glazing in circumstances where the seasons fade into the background. And I always say that for the winners of modernity, you can change seasons almost as easily as changing channels on a TV. You're never more than an air ticket away from snow or beach. You almost don't notice the strangeness of there being strawberries on the shelves in December, and so on. And so, in a way, the particular role that science plays in bringing climate change to our attention is necessary for those of us who are most removed from the conditions of our lives. And that removal is often presented as progress, as if the food that we're eating doesn't still come from places where the seasons matter. So for many of us, when we come into the conversation about climate change, it's a conversation that's framed for us by science. Climate change itself is a scientific concept. The work of the natural sciences is what helps us to understand the processes in play. And as you say, I've spent a lot of time working with climate scientists. I have a lot of respect for them. The thing that I've said, and which they have often responded to really positively, actually, because for a lot of them, it's not very comfortable having all the weight put on their shoulders. The thing I've been going around saying in these meetings is, climate change asks us questions that climate science cannot answer. And the one that I always come back to is, how did we find ourselves in this trouble? Is it down to a piece of bad luck with the atmospheric chemistry that it just happens to turn out sort of 7 generations into building an industrial society on fossil fuels, that the carbon emissions being thrown out knock the climate system out of balance sufficiently to bring to an end the benign set of climate conditions under which this thing that we talk about as human civilization has pretty much all taken part? Like, that's one answer to the question. It's not the only possible answer. Another answer would be to say, we find ourselves in this trouble because of a way of approaching the world, a way of seeing and treating everything and everyone, which would always have brought us to such a pass, even if the atmospheric chemistry had been different, even if the IPCC were to turn around tomorrow and say, guys, terribly embarrassing, we got our sums wrong, which isn't going to happen. But often the way that we end up talking about climate change, the way we end up telling the story of ecological crisis in the age of climate change, seems to imply that if only it weren't for that piece of bad luck, we could have had the Steven Pinker future, the Hans Rosling future.
Okay, so on the question of like, what is upstream of science? Like you bring up the point that our way of knowing specifically what is happening is limited because it cannot ask the right questions. It can tell us things are happening. It can tell us there's a problem, but it can't really explain what to do about the problem. And right now, actually this week, Davos, I believe, is still happening. Correct? It's like a week-long thing or something.
Yeah.
Where you have all of these really important self-appointed important people, the adults in the room, who are all discussing, what the problem is and what can be done about it. Except their solutions are never really, the solutions never change anything. It's more like they're trying to manage. They're trying to manage the climate crisis, as opposed to actually ever getting to the core problems underneath that. Could you discuss a little bit about that?
Sure. So the way I'd put it is that this thing where so long as the conversation is taking place inside the frame of science, we can't even see clearly, let alone answer questions like how did we find ourselves in this trouble. That suits the interests of those who are most invested in the way that the world is right now, because that leads to a version of taking climate change seriously that is not going to trouble their stories of the world or the ways in which they're benefiting from the way that the world is set up right now. So you've got this kind of double thing that's gone on in the last few years, where on the one hand, the boundaries of this frame of science have been much more policed. There's kind of an electric fence around that now, because we've had this intensification of believe in science, following the science, unite behind the science, that has gone on in the last few years, simultaneous with the moving of climate change to the center of the story that people like Bill Gates are telling about where the world is and what needs to be done about it. There's a passage that I
isn't it great to have billionaires tell us that? Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to say it's great when billionaires are telling us that there's a problem.
Oh yeah. And then they're telling us how them and all the people in their contact book can sort it all out, and it's all going to be fine if we just make this list of breakthroughs, i.e. as yet uninvented technologies. So, where was I going to go with that?
Yeah, you're saying there's a passage that you keep coming back to onto this question. Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. There's a passage that I keep coming back to that comes from a book that's edited by a pair of anthropologists, Mario Blazer and Marisol de la Cadena, and the book is called A World of Many Worlds. And in the introduction to it, they say this thing that gets talked about as the Anthropocene in this conversation that starts in cities like Berlin and Paris and London and New York, and that spills out into the social sciences and the arts and exhibitions in museums and books and so on. This thing, when it's heard from elsewhere, can sound a lot like the world of the powerful, in that language of the Zapatistas, the world of the powerful becoming conscious of the possibility that its world too could end. After 5 centuries of going around the world, ending worlds in the name of progress, to then have this belated discovery of the vulnerability of the world which all of that progress was meant to be pointing to. And there's 2 ways that can go. Like, that can be the moment of humbling where it suddenly becomes possible to hear things that people have been trying to say to us from being on the receiving end of processes of modernization for generations. And that is part of what's happening and going on. And that's, as I say, that's part of why I spent so much time talking with people around climate change, because it can be the entry point to that for a lot of people in the West. Sure. But it can equally go the other way, and climate change and the trouble that the world is in can become this new source of legitimacy for a project that was running out of steam. It can become the sort of last, best, most desperate basis on which to pursue a project of top-down management and control, of attempting to treat the whole world as needing to be the subject of the good intentions and plans and schemes of people who happen to be mostly located in the old centres of colonial power. And both of those stories are playing out at the same time at the moment. And part of why I want to kind of stage this intervention or try and create a bit of a rupture in the conversation about climate change is to make clear that we're not on the same side. To make clear that people who a few years ago might have felt like allies because we were all trying to say, look, this climate thing needs to be taken seriously. It needs to be at the top of everyone's agenda because it's huge and urgent and the rest of it. Partly, if we're being kind, partly because of the success of that, we're now at a point where there is a kind of fork in the road, where those of us who are not interested in contributing to a project of bringing ecological and social relationships into some kind of scheme of control and management in the name of saving the world, need to be willing to walk away and go, we are not talking about the same thing here.
So I think is, it's all throughout your book, but you're very gentle about this point. I wouldn't say too gentle. I think it's something you have to be gentle about when you're discussing. But the principle of management, that we can manage ourselves out of this crisis, and we can manage we can use management technologies to continue what we're doing, but get out of the emergency that this entire system has manufactured or has created. That underlines a lot of your book. There's a point in there where I had to read the chapter twice because it was the only time where I was like, which was the chapter called, I think, No Left Turn, because I'm a pretty hardcore Marxist here, but your criticisms are good. So within lots of political frameworks or political ideologies or what have you, there's usually two tendencies. There's the one that says, hey, this is the problem, we need less of this. And then there's the other tendency that says, this is the problem, we need to do this better. You bring up a lot about the problem of fully automated luxury communism, which is something that I've critiqued as well. There's a kind of management left, I think. This idea that the industrial capitalist stage of history, and it requires a stagist idea of history, that there are progressive stages that we move from one point to another, that we can keep this around, and then if we manage it better, if we organize it better, and that might require cracking some heads, or it might require some, authoritarianism, then we can have everything we already have and not mess up the climate. And then there's the other side of this. There's the other tendency, which you tend to see more in autonomous Marxist groups like the Zapatistas, the ones who use the Marxist framework, but also don't believe in the stagist idea of history and instead kind of weave back in their own animist understanding of the land around them that says, no, actually, we need a different story. Like, we know that this is the problem, but so we should get rid of that problem. Like, we can't keep pouring more human intellectual effort into trying to maintain a system that is completely destroying stuff. Like, let's undo that and find a different story, which I think you do extremely well throughout the entire book. You see that, of course, right-wing tendencies as well. There are there's a technological rightism that thinks that what we need is just a better management. You see this very much in what's kind of happening in China now with the social credit system, where we need to manage society and the morality of society in order to allow some people to have access to certain things that cause carbon, or take that away from other people, so that we can start limiting these resources. But again, this is management. We can manage our way out of the system. But throughout the entire book, you're questioning that narrative of management. That what we need to do is, you're challenging the idea that we just need more experts telling us how to fix what we have so we can keep having what we have without any of the problems.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a book that I touch on very briefly in the next to last chapter. It's a great book by my friend Dean Bavington, who's an environmental historian from Newfoundland. He grew up in Newfoundland and lived through the collapse of the cod fishery there, then became an environmental historian in order to research and tell the story of the place that he came from. And what Dean looks at is the kind of double collapse of the Newfoundland cod fishery, where it collapsed first through industrial overfishing, and then it became the kind of case study in the scientific management of fisheries. And they were like, the fishery is recovering, we can go back out and fish, we're going to set these quotas, we now know how to manage this wild fishery. And for a few years, it looks like it's working, and then it collapses again. And what Dean tracks is this kind of, at that point, you get this this failure of the ambitions of modernist scientific management to make a wild system knowable and manageable. So what do you do? On the one hand, you introduce restrictions that make no distinction between commercial exploitation and vernacular ways of fishing, and don't recognize that that's where things began to go wrong. But on the other hand, you create fish farms. So you cannot manage the wild because it's too complex. So you give up on that and you attempt to construct a simpler, more manageable version that just produces the output you're looking for. And in a sense, this is the story that people have been telling of how the origins of capitalism go back beyond the factory to the plantation, that the plantation is where the kind of new models of labor and production are first worked out, and then they're brought home and implemented in the new big factories. And all of this is kind of this brutal simplification of a world that is made of relationships, human and more than human, in order to maximize the outputs of a few measurable things in order to maximize profit. So the political story that I'm telling in the book is one of industrial society having been built on the defeat of an earlier struggle. And this story came to me from Ivan Illich and his friends. There are other people who tell it very well, Jeremy Seabrook and Trevor Blackwell, in some little books that they wrote in the late 80s and early 90s, do an amazing job of this. There are plenty of people from the Global South who have told versions of this story. But it's what Illich calls the war on subsistence. So people fought long and hard to defend vernacular ways of organizing life against this new industrial mode of production. And then by about the 1840s, you reach this point where that struggle has been lost in the center. It's still ongoing at the periphery to this day, but it's been lost in the world's most modern countries. And so instead, this new frame of politics arises, which Seabrook and Blackwell describe in this brilliant passage that I quote, where they sort of say, after about the time of the Chartists, it's no longer serious to question the frame of industrial society. And so the space of politics becomes instead this struggle over the organization of industrial production and the distribution of its benefits and its outputs. And they would locate Marxism as having played an important role in the establishment of that new political frame, because they say, part of the role Marxism came to play was that it sounded so extreme and bloodthirsty that it was very effective at mapping the furthest out position, and therefore pushing out of view the possibility that there were positions that still legitimately could critique the whole industrial mode of production. Now that's, I've worked with people who would question that. Gustavo Esteva, who brought together Illich's work and Marxist traditions, would very much have said that the late Marx, there is a different approach to the role of peasants, and therefore to vernacular modes of production that can get you into the conversation that you and I think would want to be having. But historically, certainly that's one of the functions that Marxism fell into playing, was kind of policing the radical end of the spectrum of what could be taken seriously as politics. Now, by the 60s and 70s, environmentalism was bringing back, often from the front lines of science, so much evidence of the hidden and repressed consequences and costs of industrial society that for a while it opened this space where, at least on the edges of the field of politics, it became possible again to call the industrial mode of production into question. And then by the early 1990s, for a variety of reasons, you get this kind of technocratic turn in environmentalism, where partly because these issues are rising on the political agenda by the late 80s and early 90s, you get a generation who go, right, well, we need to take ourselves seriously and be taken seriously. We've got the scientific evidence now, so instead of engaging in this kind of critique of worldviews, we can just show the evidence, and that's what modern society says it takes seriously, is scientific evidence. And meanwhile, within the kind of, if that was going on at one layer within environmentalism, you also had a bunch of people coming out of the left following 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union, looking for a new vehicle for a radical left politics. And some of them, like Seabrook and Blackwell, went on a really amazing journey of weaving together these strands. But others were more kind of opportunistically moving into Green parties in countries like the UK in an entryist way that had been part of certain traditions for a long time anyway. And so between the sort of, on the one hand, the technocratic professionalization of environmentalism, and on the other hand, the kind of entryist version of the arrival of the post-89 left, the environmental politics that was capable of breaking the frame that had been established in the 1840s really kind of was marginalized and lost its way by the time I was showing up in environmental activism in the 90s. And so, in a way, we're now reaching the end game of the climate-centered environmentalism that was partly a product of that technocratic moment. You know, we've got politicians who stood at the last round of elections saying this is the last parliamentary term in which we have a chance of meeting the Paris goals. And they're asking themselves quietly, like, what do we say next time around? Do we pretend we didn't say that? Do we pretend there's nothing left worth doing? And out of that, I'm finding people who I didn't expect are coming wanting to have conversations with me about the things that I'm saying in this book. So that's, again, like part of the sense that we're now on a threshold to a new place. But part of the difficulty of it is, you know, if you go back to that pre-1840s war against subsistence, it doesn't map very easily to the left-right spectrum. You know, there are people who would strongly argue that there is a kind of a peasant right that emerges after the French Revolution that is the original resistance to left liberal capitalism and, you know, the bourgeois regime that is emerging in the late 18th, early 19th century. I'm not really even interested in the labels or whatever, but like rolling forward to today, and I think probably you and I are both experiencing this writing in a space like Substack, which has a strange mixture of voices and people interacting with each other. Once you start to try and articulate some of the things I'm saying in this book, you find yourself very far away from some of the people who you might have thought of as comrades on the left. And you find yourself in surprisingly kind of open conversations with people who are definitely coming from very different places politically. And I'm not saying that I'm particularly comfortable with that. I still see myself as someone coming from the left, even if I'm not convinced those labels mean that much where we're going. But one way that I try and land a possible coexistence with that in the book is to go to Polanyi and the double movement and sort of Polanyi's story of how on the one hand you have this top-down sort of great reset of the early 19th century of laissez-faire, that's a top-down project, and on the other hand, in response to that, you don't have something as coherent as the kind of the Marxist class analysis might want it to be of where the forces of resistance come from. The counter movement in Polanyi's version of the story is kind of popping up all over the place from different political traditions and religious and cultural and social movements, without necessarily having a shared analysis, but simply responding to the reality on the ground of the devastation that is being caused.
I'm just gonna just say for a moment. So we've had many recording difficulties. So you'll notice that Dougald has suddenly changed because speaking of ruins and systems breaking down and all of that, we've had lots of problems with this. So it's been fun though, and as I said, it was kind of a great setup for our first meeting for everything to kind of fall apart. But so we're trying to pick up the thread, which is funny because it's your last point. We're trying to pick up the thread of what we were just talking about. So with, in many situations, the things that we think are good are only good because they're compensations for what we lost. The idea that you can get anything you want at the supermarket, or you could, that itself is kind of falling apart right now. You start hearing lots of stories of people like, no, they don't have this anymore in my grocery store. That's really strange because we got so used to this being what you can do because of modernity and because of capitalism. But even those systems of compensation are falling apart. But for, your point in the book, and you were about to talk about how Gabor Mate kind of describes that problem of, what we think is good and what is a compensation for what it is we're deeply lacking.
Yeah, I think he's somebody who is kind of managing to speak in this very calm and very kind of related to science, quite mainstream voice, very clearly about how much of what we think of as normal is made up of these compensations for living in a toxic society. And it's really interesting to me how people are coming in from different edges or different corners to these conversations now. I think of Ian McGilchrist's work as well, The Master and His Emissary. It feels like, compared to when Paul and I were starting work on Dark Mountain back in 2007, 2008, there's a lot more entry points and a lot more people showing up with different pieces of the puzzle. And for me, as so often, I find myself going back to Ivan Illich, and I feel it was Illich who helped me grasp this thing of how often we are identifying some deep social good with the particular institutional form which has been granted a monopoly on it around here lately. There's a guy in Canada, I think he's David Rasmussen, who has written about the restaurant theory of education, where he's like, Western NGOs and so on go around the world looking for education and assuming it's not there if they can't find schools, and therefore they need to parachute schools in, which is a bit like looking for food. And if you can't find restaurants, there's no food there, as if the only way that people can feed each other will be the healthiest, sanest way to organize feeding ourselves and eating is restaurants. And anyone who has ever worked in a restaurant knows that that's a very one-sided picture of what the restaurant as an institution is like. And the same thing goes for lots of the other institutions through which our needs have been met around here. Like
a long time ago,
that's part of what that's.
Yeah, a long time ago, when I started noticing that there was kind of this problem that you point out very well in the book. I guess this was like 15 years ago, the first time I really started noticing this. I was listening to this report by some, they weren't climate scientists, they were policy, like climate policy sorts. And they were advising NGOs about how they could help the world to avoid climate catastrophe, etc. And the discussion was on African cook fires. That, we could fix climate change, except we have all of these people in Africa who are cooking their food on wood or on other plant sources. And what we need to do is electrify Africa so that everyone can be using electric stoves, and then we wouldn't have climate change. And that kind of brings, that's in line with Bayo Akalamafi's. Wait, you just talked to him, didn't you?
Yeah, we were on a call last week. I'm going to meet up with him in
Oh, how
Hamburg. He's
lovely.
moved to Europe
I'm
for
very
half a
jealous.
year.
I'm jealous of that, and I'm very jealous of you getting to hang out with Vandana. That's yeah, she's my hero, and then so now you're my hero for being the getting to talk with her. But his point about and Gordon White brings this up very often in his book Animistic as well. The Bio's point about the what if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? Like this idea that we're using the framework of the crisis, or the framework that got us into the crisis, to try to solve these things. That if what we need to do is fix these problems, and then we can get over the crisis. But then that increases the crisis. Like the idea of we just need to get these primitive people into modernity, and then we can fix everything. It's like, well, no, actually, us getting into modernity, this kind of illusion that we're under, that we are somehow special and different. And you bring up the point in the book about, modernity's idea is that we are closer to the future than we are to the past. What others have called like chronopolitics, that the way that we look at time now as this progression, and we're almost at the future. We are technically building the future right now, and the past is so far behind us, and we need to bring the rest of the world, especially, there's often very much a colonialist, racist aspect to that. The people that we have to bring into modernity happen to not be very pale-skinned. And so with this idea of looking at what is good, a lot of times it's just only the things that we ourselves think are good, and that we have decided get us through and make this new system that we've come up with give us meaning. But the rest of the world didn't even really bother with those compensations, because they didn't get the rest of the deal either. Or they got the awful part but didn't get the compensations, and then we say, "Oh, poor them. They don't have electric cars in Africa. We need to do this. We need to get them." It's like, well, no, they are digging the cobalt with slave labor and all of the other rare minerals in order to make sure that we have our computers and all of our compensations, what we think is good. And the final part of this, what you talk about picking up the threads that we dropped. And I love this, because I've always loved the idea of worldviews and cosmologies being weaving. The way that we put together things from many different threads. And there's a fun etymological thing with cosmos. The word cosmos in Greek versus universe, which is a different concept, comes from the idea of braided flowing hair. So the mane on a horse, when it's braided, that is associated with the root that we use for cosmos. And you're talking about, we dropped all these threads at the very beginning of this story that we're in, but those threads could have been another story, and they haven't gone away. That resistance that you were talking about earlier, up to about 1840, the idea of the peasant versus the urban bourgeois resistance to this new system. There are still peasants. It's not like we've
Yeah.
the story in modernity is that the past is gone, the past is done, and yet oftentimes the past is right there. Like the ruins that we're talking about are the past that we can still build from. The way that, you know, peasant farmers would take the massive stones from imperial palaces and use those to build their homes. So yeah, so on that idea, can you talk about like one of those threads, or how you think that we can each, and it's not going to be the same story each time, and we're not going to be picking up the same threads, but how we can, you know, start to reweave those again, and not so much, you know, not so much revolt against this modern story, but to tell a different story instead.
Well, there are certain common threads, if you like. It's like every culture is a set of riffs on living and dying, eating and being eaten, the feast and the funeral. And so anything that is, both like practicing food growing, practicing gathering people around the table, that is something which humans have been doing in all these different ways in so many times and places, and we've often lost the knack of invitation. We're helpless in a way that is new because of our dependence on these modern industrial systems. Like, there have never been humans until very, very recently who were as helpless when it comes to knowing how to feed themselves and care for each other and meet the needs of their households and their communities. But for all that the monopoly on doing all of that has been passed into institutional structures of the market and the state in recent history in more and more parts of the world, the knowledge is not yet completely erased. The capacity is still lingering around, and it's there. As you say, when it comes to the peasants, the lens of modernity is this extraordinary distorting sort of fairground mirror thing, which makes people who are still here in the present, whose work goes into the food we eat, look like they are in the past because of this powerful story. And so somehow it's plausible that the future of the way we're going to feed ourselves is going to involve these 2 billion peasant farmers around the world going away very soon, and us all eating stuff that looks like what this one startup in Finland is growing in vats. And it's like, to me, that's just evidence of how powerful a story can be, that, decent, well-intentioned people can really believe that stuff. And, one of the things I noticed in all the years of being invited into the rooms where the conversations about climate change happen is that there's this assumption that's rarely put explicitly in those rooms, but which is that if we're going to somehow, whatever the word is, come through this, I don't want to say fix it, if we're going to come through this, it's going to be because of the efforts of the kinds of people who are invited into those rooms. Like, the agency is all located, it's not just that it's all located with the human and the rest of the living world is left out of the story. It's all located with a tiny subset of the human, who are these, mostly rich but helpless people who, through the lens of modernity, look like the ones who live closest to the future, and therefore the ones who are paving the way that everybody else is going to follow. But the more time I've spent with people like, whether it's Vandana Shiva or Gustavo Esteva, any of these, incredibly powerful voices from the rest of the world, the more I realize how, that just makes people laugh when they hear us talk like that. And the danger that I began to see, which again is part of how I ended up writing this book, and maybe this brings us full circle, is I started to meet these people deep inside some of the powerful institutions that are, getting scared about climate change, and where people are trying to take climate change seriously, who'd reached this very strange mode of despair that was different to anything that I'd encountered around the campfire at a Dark Mountain festival, for all that Paul and I used to get slated for being doomers. Because this despair, this institutional despair, it was like people who had lost their faith in the promises of their institutions. They no longer believed that these institutions, be they state and international institutions or big corporations or whatever, they no longer believed the story about how they were going to save the world and fix climate change and build a sustainable future. But they hadn't questioned the theology. They were still attached to the assumption that the world was the kind of thing that needs saving, and that it needed saving by people like them in institutions like theirs. And so once they could no longer believe in the institutional promises, they reach this flat despair where they think they know how the story ends. Or even worse, they cycle backwards and forwards between that and these desperate attempts at optimism, which legitimate more and more desperate and dangerous strategies for fixing climate change. And this is how we will get on the path towards geoengineering and the rest of it. So I guess part of why I wanted to write this book was to offer a sort of bridge out of either that place of flat despair or that loop between despair and desperate optimism, and say, you don't know how the story ends, and actually none of us knows.
And you are sideways now. I'm not sure why.
Oh dear.
This has been quite an adventure. Again, thank you so much for your patience on this. So for anybody who, first of all, I recommend Dougald's book. It is an absolutely excellent book. It's published by Chelsea Green, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And then also your Substack, which is called Writing Home. Is that dougald.substack.com? Is that what
that's it? Yeah, I copied your thing of just having the first name and then Substack.
Oh, okay, cool. and then finally, if you are in England, Scotland, or Frankfurt, Germany, I guess there's two Frankfurts in Germany, but if you're in one of those places in February, you're going to be doing a kind of brief book tour. That's correct?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. I'm hitting the road in the first week of February, and I couldn't bear the idea of just giving the same talk night after night to different audiences. So pretty much all the events, it's going to be getting together with people, some of them old friends, some of them people whose work I've found really, really interesting. And so I'm doing events with Alistair McIntosh and Gail Bradbrook and just a bunch of other people along the road. So yeah, come and join us at one of those if you can.
Great, cool. Thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for this conversation. Hopefully at the end it actually looks like something. I'm going to have to splice about 20 video clips together. But this has been a great conversation. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, really, really nice to get together after having been following your work for a long time. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I adore your work. So, okay.
Thank you for listening to The Realign. I'm Reed Wildermuth. In this third episode, I spoke with Dougald Hine. Dougald was an environmental journalist and activist, as well as the co-founder of Dark Mountain. He now writes on Substack at dougald.substack.com, and he runs a school called Home with Anna Björkman. Dougald's recent book, which will be released on 9 February 2023, is called At Work in the Ruins: Finding Our Place in the Time of Science, Climate Change, Pandemics, and All the Other Emergencies. You can find links to Dougald's book and other work, as well as more information about The Realign at read.substack.com. That's rhyd.substack.com. Thanks for listening.